In Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, it states, "Then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground." And when you hear that, you think that is such an amazing verse, right? Like God is basically saying, hey, I've created all these things, and you, human beings, you can have it all. You can have the birds in the sky, the fish in the sea, all the animals across the entire planet. You can have magical things like the Great Barrier Reef, the Rocky Mountains, the Grand Canyon, humongous hot springs that reflect every color of the rainbow. My creation is indescribable, and you can have it all. And when you hear those verses, you think, man, that is such a massive verse, right? You're like, that's amazing that God would give us reign and domain over all of his creation here on earth. And yet, while that verse is so big, the one that follows it may be even more important, maybe even bigger than that. In Genesis 1:27, it states, "So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them." And this verse is so important because not only did God create the universe and create the earth to function a certain way, he wired us. He created us. And while he created us to interact with the earth and to have domain over the earth, he created us different than every other thing, and that he created us in his image. And because God created us in his image, there are certain attributes, there are certain things about God that are hardwired into us. God said, for them to be created in my image, for them to reflect my image, I must put characteristics of me inside of these humans, my most precious creation. The problem is we don't always recognize those attributes in that way, right? Like many of you might say, hey, what could little old me, what sort of attributes could little old me have in common with the attributes of a mighty and powerful God? And my response to that is, what are some of the attributes of God? To help answer that question tonight, I brought with me my friend here. It's a mannequin, yes, I understand. But I want you to envision this mannequin as the blank slate that God used when he was putting human beings together. And maybe for an instance, you can imagine that this mannequin is you when God was creating you. And God said, hey, I have to create human beings in my image. I have to give them certain attributes, certain characteristics, certain traits that resemble me. So I have to start with that. And God probably said, well, you know, I'm all powerful. I create the sun, the moon, and the stars. I control the universe. I am strong. So inevitably, he said, if I'm going to create a human being, I'm going to have to make them to be strong. And so God made human beings strong. And then God probably said, I care for my entire creation. Everything that I put in the earth, I care for. And I'm kind. So if I'm going to create a human being, I'm going to have to create this being to be kind, like me. And so God made us kind. And then he said, hey, I am love. And for people to understand what that means, I'm going to have to create human beings to be loving so that they understand what love feels like. So he put this idea, this character trait of loving others in humans. And so he made us loving. And then he said, I make the best decisions. I've created the entire universe. I have wisdom that goes beyond all things. And if these creatures, these human beings are going to have domain and reign over all of my creation, they will have to be wise like me. So he made us wise. And I can only imagine that God went down the list. And he probably said, I have all these character traits. He says, I understand what joy is, so I must make them joyful. I understand mercy and what mercy means, so I'm going to have to create human beings to be merciful. And so he made us merciful. And the truth is, you've all seen these attributes play out in people around you. You've seen it, right? Like people go through a difficult circumstance and you're like, I don't know how they were able to endure it. They are just so strong. Or you notice somebody that literally made an unbelievable decision in a very difficult time and they made the exact right decision and you were like, they were just so wise, and yet it stopped there and we didn't recognize that it was the attributes of God that were woven into that individual. You might know somebody that is completely selfless, that all they want to do is help others. And you say, I can't believe how they dedicate their entire time to help other people. They're just so selfless. And often the thought stops right there. And it doesn't go on to this idea that their selflessness is a characteristic of God woven into them, hardwired into their being when He created us in His image. It's amazing. Every time you see one of these attributes playing out in somebody, they're literally reflecting the image of God in which they were created. But it doesn't stop there. I bet that there are so many other characteristics, character traits of God that He was just like, I have to put this into human beings, right? They're merciful, they're joyful, they have discernment, they're compassionate, they have all these things, and yet He probably said, for them to be like me, there is another really important, really prominent ingredient. They have to be just. Now, when I say just, right? When I say the word just, many of you right now are probably thinking, well, Matt, that's kind of awkward. That's kind of weird. What do you mean about just, right? Like, I understand mercy. I understand loving. I understand compassion. I understand love. I understand kindness, because we talk about those things all the time in church. And you're bringing up this idea of God being just, but the truth is, why does it matter if I'm just? After all, isn't God the one who basically decides what's right or wrong? Isn't God the one who we ultimately have to answer to? So why does it matter if I'm just? What's the point? Verse upon verse, reference upon reference throughout the Bible, it talks about God being just. There are some verses here on the screen. These are just a few of them. And the truth is, there are over 300 different references to God being just, to God being a just God and God's justice throughout Scripture. And we don't have time to go through them tonight, but just understand it is so important to God that He has woven it into our character to reflect His image, because He is just. Now, when we think about that, when we think about this idea of God being just, you might say, well, what does that mean? Like, if we don't have time to read through all these verses, if we can't go through all 300 different references in the Bible, what does it mean for God to be just? What is the big idea? Well, what it really means is that God is fair and that God is impartial. And furthermore, it means that God hates the oppression and ill treatment of His creation. And as we heard in those verses in Genesis, we understand that human beings are His most important creation. And so God would detest the oppression and ill treatment of human beings. It said, let us make human beings in our image. And when He said that, there was no reference to race. There was no reference to ethnicity. There was no reference to opportunity. There was no reference to culture. It was literally, let us make human beings in our image, establishing one race, the human race, created in our image to reflect our image to the world. And what's so amazing is that we are so uniquely different. Every single human being is uniquely different. Yet we all reflect the same message, the same image to the world. God is just. And because He is just, He hates bigotry, He hates prejudice, and He hates racism. He just does. And some of you might hear that and you're like, hey, Matt, if God hates bigotry, if God hates racism, if God hates prejudice, why is it the only thing that I see everywhere right now? If He hates bigotry, prejudice, and racism, Literally, why is it everywhere? It seems to be the only thing that's trending right now. Whether I turn on the news, look at my news feed, all of my hashtags are related to racism and prejudice and injustice. And it seems to be the only thing that's going on right now. And if he hates all those things, why is that the case? Why is that where the world is currently? And before I answer that question, I want to make one thing abundantly clear. This is not just a trending issue. This is not just a new problem. This isn't a 2020 issue like Corona. This has been an issue for a very long time. Check out this graphic. The other day when I was scrolling through my social media feed, I saw this graphic, and I'm sorry, I can't remember whose feed I pulled it off of, but when I saw it, it hit me like a ton of bricks. And the reason why it hit me like a ton of bricks is because me, like much of the world, responds to what's trending now. A lot. I do. I know I look at hashtags, I look at what's going on in the news, the 24-hour news cycle, what's popping off next. And the problem with that is that oftentimes we focus just on the things that are trending now, and we don't give things, real problems, the time, energy, and thought that they deserve. We just move on to the next thing that happens. And when something else bad happens, yep, that's where all of our hashtags go. But the truth is, we should be sitting on things like this. We should be working through them. And when you see this graphic, you understand it's not hard to see that the issue of racism, since Europeans landed on this continent, goes far beyond what's trending now. And it's systematic, and it's systemic. And unfortunately, for the last 500 years, it has been both intentionally and unintentionally woven into our culture. The truth is, racism is a sin. And like all sin, it has an ugly history of breaking the heart of God. It just does. It breaks God's heart. And you might say, well, Matt, if it's an ugly sin and it breaks God's heart, like ultimately, why does it even exist? Why does God allow it to exist? And here's the thing. When God created us in his image, he gave us this thing called free will. He gave human beings the ability to choose between this and that, what's right and what's wrong. And when we don't choose right and we choose what's wrong, we fail to reflect the image of God to a world that needs it. And ultimately, there is a lot less God in the world and a whole lot more evil. The truth is, if you wanted to boil down this big idea to why it's important for us to be just, we must be just. We have to practice justice because we have to reflect the image of God to a world that drastically needs him. And when it comes to the human race, where there is way more empathy, there is way more humanity. And a lack of empathy will always lead to a lack of humanity. And you might say, well, Matt, I get it, right? I think I know where you're going. And here's the thing, I sympathize for your feelings right now, right? Like 2020 has not been a banner year. Gonna be honest with you. We had a global pandemic that shut down the world this spring. We have people that have been laid off. We have kids that weren't able to go to school. And in the midst of it, we have literally the greatest oppression our country has experienced surfacing. People are hurting. It's just such a bad thing right now. Like, it just seems so negative, everything in the news. But let me let you in on a little secret. It doesn't let you off the hook. It doesn't let me off the hook of our responsibility to reflect the image of God that he created us to be. And when I say that, we have a responsibility to fight prejudice and racism. We have a responsibility to reflect the image of God and advocate for those who haven't had a voice. And you say, okay, Matt, I understand what that means, or kind of do, but I'm going to need some specific action steps from you because this does, while it's been around forever, seem like a very trending thing. What am I supposed to do? Well, the first thing I think you need to do is have some real awkward, difficult, and hard conversations. And that goes for all of us. Honestly, we could all use a lot more difficult, hard conversations with people that don't look like us. It's just the way it needs to be, right? And you say, well, Matt, what does that look like? You know, how do I have that conversation? Don't they want to start the conversation with me? And I'll say, I don't know what that looks like. The truth be told, you'll probably just stumble into it. But hey, I do know some guardrails for you during that conversation. And it comes from the words of Jesus' brother. In the book of James, James tells us that when it comes to our conversations, he says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. And so I don't know what those conversations are going to look like for you. I don't know how awkward they're going to be. I don't know how difficult they are. But I do know that when you go into those conversations, open your ears and close your mouth a little bit. I need to do the same thing. We all have to be quick to listen and slow to speak and just hear what people that don't look like us have to say. The second thing we need to do is we need to stand up to racism. We cannot allow racism in our classrooms. We cannot allow it in our locker rooms. We cannot allow it in our boardrooms. We cannot allow it in our offices. And when I say that, I want you to understand this. It's not enough to just not be racist. We have to fight racism. That's called the sin of indifference, right? Well, I'm not racist, so everything's okay. No, that's not good enough. It just isn't. We need to be looking out for one another as human beings because we are all created in God's image to reflect the image of God. The Apostle Paul would eloquently write, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. That means that we have to really put people in front of ourselves. To advocate for someone, we have to put their wishes, their needs, and their desires and their voice in front of ours. And truth be told, we should have started doing this a long time ago. And finally, the last thing we need to do, and this might be for our Christians, our Christian brothers, is that we need to constantly remind each other that we serve one agenda, and that's the agenda of God. And it doesn't matter, anything else is not as important. Your political ideas, your stands, your voice, what you want to say on this or that, or whatever Facebook post you want to make about your view as whether you're conservative or whether you're liberal, there are not two sides of the aisle when it comes to God's agenda. There is one side. You have to use your unbelievable, widespread sphere of influence. And what does that mean? That means that if you're in a locker room and you hear somebody that you spend time with all the time and you look at and you're like, yeah, they're a Christian, and they say something that's off color, you say, hey man, that's not right. You know better than that. We're not created to be like that. That you take that moment to intervene on behalf of your fellow human being that was created in the image of God. You see, here's the thing. We must be just because God is just. And we were created in his image to reflect his image to the world. It's not an option. That's what we were created to do. So as you go to your small groups, I want you to think about that. What does it mean to be just, and what can I do to reflect God's image to a broken world? Specifically, what can I do to fight the injustice of prejudice and racism around me? Thanks.